everyone for coming and for braving both the traffic and the weather, which is sort of a double whammy. But of course, you are intrepid Winnipeggers, so it's really a delight to see you here. I'm thrilled to be able to launch what is the beginning of a series. This is sort of the soft launch of a series called Beyond Crisis, the Middle East, Past, Present, Future. And it's an event series where I hope to put on several events throughout the academic term, bringing in scholars, mostly historians, but some others as well, to talk about issues that I think matter to us about the Middle East, and to help widen the debates that we have and to enhance our ability as people who live in Winnipeg, which is very far away from the Middle East, to engage in the debates which, although it is far away, still affect us. And of course we have refugee communities that have come in the last year which testify to the relevance of what's going on in the Middle East to our societies here, and our communities here. So I'm really thrilled to be able to open this series with Juan, who is a professor at the University of Michigan. He is really a wonderful example of a historian who speaks the languages of the region, who approaches the region not only from the vantage point of the West, but has also worked and studied India and South Asia, and so also approaches the Middle East from the vantage point of the East. And that's a perspective that we often don't get here. That's not necessarily what he's talking about today, but that we have the advantage today of somebody who really has a global perspective on the Middle East. He's here to talk this time about, this time as opposed to the next 5 times that he's coming. Sorry. He was here to talk about youth and the role of youth in politics in the Arab world since the 2011 uprisings, which of course have really changed the face of the Middle East and North Africa that we know today. He is the author of many books. I will not embarrass him too much. A book on the new Arabs, who are the wired youth who are transforming the Arab world today. So we're going to hear about some of the themes that he talks about in that book. He has also translated Khalil Gibran. He has a blog which you can visit. I encourage you to visit it, called Informed Comment, if you are not aware of it, where you can really learn a great deal about what's going on, both what he writes and also what he posts from other writers. It's a wonderful source for learning about what's going on in the Middle East, material that doesn't necessarily cross our radar. He has also commented extensively in the US media. There's a very, very long list of shows that he's been on. I won't read them all out. So we really are very lucky to have him here today, and I'm sure this will be a fabulous talk. Save up your questions because there will be a Q&A after the talk. So without any further ado, join me in welcoming Juan for tonight's talk.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer, for that warm welcome, and I think you overdid the introduction because now I have to really be on my game to live up to it. But thanks so much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. So my task today is to talk about whatever happened to the Arab Spring, I think. That's what I'm often asked because I wrote that book. And it's all right. Those young people are still there and they haven't gone anywhere. The Middle East is a particularly young place. We often don't think about the world in terms of its mean average age, but you can see from this map that in Spain they're kind of actually middle-aged. In America we're we use euphemisms a lot, so we call old geezers like me middle-aged. But in Spain, the median age is 42, in France 41, Greece 44. But in Egypt it's 23, and Tunisia is a little older at 31. Maybe that's why they've had more success. And Libya is 28 and Syria 24. The Middle East is not unique in being so young. This is also true of South Asia, for instance. Indians and Pakistanis are unusually young in world terms. But it is a distinctive set of challenges. When you have such a big proportion of your population young, well, a lot of them are turning 18 every year or 22, looking for a job. Is the society providing them that job? And often the answer is no. Moreover, the young people in this region have been unusually involved in politics for the last decade. Again, this is not necessarily common. And by the way, it's not always common in the United States. So the youth in the United States often don't vote. People in their 20s don't vote. And some of the political disasters that we have experienced have been because those young people screwed us over. And so their non-voting has resulted in electoral victories for people that they don't like very much. And so to have people energized at that age and intervening in politics is a little unusual. But in the Middle East, for presidents for life, or at least that's what they thought they were, have been overthrown as a result of youth activism. People often ask me, they say, well, didn't the whole movement fail? Well, it depends on what you think it was about. If it was to get rid of those presidents for life, it succeeded admirably. Now, it is true that in the aftermath of the youth revolts of 2011 through roughly 2014, there has been a severe counter-revolution, and mostly made by, I'm 65, so it's people my age that are the villains of this piece, who were very threatened by all this youth activism. And so King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, as it was then, and Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt. I call him President Field Marshal Sisi because he really is a military officer, but he pretends to be a president. And so for these older people, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who just was killed, again, has been entered politics in 1962. They staged these authoritarian counter-revolutions against the youth. There's part of the story of the Middle East for the last decade has been a struggle between the 20-somethings and the 60-somethings. I regret to say that the 60-somethings appear to be winning some of these political battles, but not everywhere. And one good thing about being youthful and having political aspirations is that the people who are opposing you, who are 60-something, will definitely not be able to oppose you forever. There's been opinion polling of the youth. It's not picking me up. The opinion polling has been done of the youth in the aftermath of these revolutions. So in 2016, what are they afraid of? What concerns them? What are their aspirations? Well, the top obstacles they thought were facing the Middle East in 2016 were the rise of the so-called Islamic State group, or ISIL, In the Middle East, they call it Daesh. The impression was often gained from the mass media in the West that this group was popular somehow. But of course, actually, it was a kind of mafia and took people hostage at the point of a gun. And when you asked them, are they worried about them, 50% said it's the #1 challenge facing their societies. And the threat of terrorism was just below, and of course they meant the same thing by that. But you get past security and terrorism, what's next on the list for young people in the region is unemployment. And that was one of the things they were complaining about in 2011. Then they've been worried about social turbulence and turmoil, and of course, this is ironic because they were part of the cause for that. They just wanted to change the system. They didn't want everyday life to be always up in the air. Rising cost of living, again, an economic concern is high on their list. Lack of strong political leadership. They think that a lot of their leaders are not doing a good job. About a quarter of them think that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is a major challenge facing their societies. And this is all through the Middle East, so these are not people who necessarily live close to Israel or Palestine, but they're psychologically very invested in that issue on the whole. A lack of Arab unity, you could say that again, and lack of democracy, again, a little over a fifth think that that's the major challenge facing the region. So you can see, I think a lot of Western observers assumed that these youth in the streets in 2011 were mainly trying to get parliamentary democracy. I think a certain proportion of them were, and they certainly wanted more individual liberties than they have. But as you can see, a lot of their concerns are elsewhere. They're economic, they have to do with social cohesion and so forth. Then in the West, I complain bitterly all the time that there's only one lens through which the Middle East is seen, which is Islam. And it's weird. The United States is 75% Protestant. When we go to analyze politics in the United States, well, you have to take into account the importance of the evangelical vote, although it's declined in importance from 25% to 17% in the last decade. But we don't interpret everything that happens in the United States as, you know, the Methodists. Whereas it is very common to interpret everything that happens in the Middle East as somehow something to do with Islam. More recently, you know, it's been considered that a conflict between the Sunni Muslims, not the Sunni Muslims as some of the cable TV shows say, the Sunni Muslims and the Shiite Muslims drives all the politics in the region. But then two Sunni states, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, emerged as at daggers drawn. So what is that? And a lot of the conflicts don't have to do with religion at all. They're about geopolitics, they're about economics, they're about markets. There's all kinds of reasons to have conflict besides religion. So when you ask the youth in Palestine and in Morocco, more than 6 in 10 feel that whatever Islam is there isn't adequate, that it needs to be reformed. There's a really severe difference between religious practice in the older generation and the younger generation in some countries. Lebanon, only 50% of Lebanese youth say that religion is extremely important to them. It's a much higher percentage in older people in Lebanon. In Tunisia, there's a 15-point spread on religious practice, how likely people are to pray regularly and listen to the Quran and so forth. And of course, then they're very worried about terrorism. Muslim terrorism is one of their chief concerns. When you ask them, well, why do people become terrorists? They say, well, you know, foreign occupation. The United States invaded and occupied Iraq. You could predict that that would cause a certain amount of trouble. And the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. But then they also blame corrupt and authoritarian governments for terrorism because people, you know, terrorism is a form of deviance, and sociologists will tell us that when people can't get to their goal in an ordinary way, well, take the way around and become deviants. There was a lot of bank robbing back in the Great Depression. It was because people couldn't make a living in the ordinary way. I fear that there has been a downward trend in the estimation of the United States among the youth in the Middle East. A survey done last spring already showed this. 32% thought the United States is their enemy in 2016. In spring of 2017, 49% said this. So it went from about less than a third to nearly half. And the proportion rises above 50% in 8 countries: Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon. These are supposed to be like non-NATO allies of the United States, but their youth think the United States is their enemy. The number of youth in the Middle East who see the U.S. as a friend has fallen from 63% in 2016 to 46% last spring. I think it's probably fallen further. Well, why did the youth become involved in politics? Why did they insist on trying to overthrow these presidents for life? I think there was a violation of their expectations. The moral economy of their societies was being contravened. They grew up in republics, many of them with a socialist tinge. Opinion polls are very clear about this. If you ask the Egyptian public, what is the purpose of the government? They think it's to take care of them. This is maybe not a big surprise in Canada. In the United States, a lot of Americans don't want the government coming anywhere near them, much less taking care of them. And it explains a lot about the United States. They have this different attitude. But in the Middle East, if the government's not taking care of you, then there's no point in having it, and maybe it should be gone. Well, in the 60s and 70s, post-colonial governments came to power who had a developmental program. A place like Egypt had been left by the British Empire, no offense, as a basket case. No industry to speak of, mainly farmers growing cotton for the factories of Manchester and not being paid very much for it. And that's no way to make a living in the 20th century. So when Gamal Abdel Nasser kicked the British out in the Suez Crisis of '56 and after, he started using government revenues to build factories and begin to industrialize the country. And then they built the Aswan Dam to generate electricity for the factories. And so the government was a developmental state. It also made unrealistic pledges of employment and education. The university system vastly expanded, and so forth. But by the 1990s, because of pressure from the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and then pressure from elites in Washington, D.C., London, Paris, these governments were being told that they were inefficient, they weren't growing, and that the only way forward was for them to begin privatizing public goods. And the philosophy that privatizing public goods like education, the airlines, routes, and so forth, will make the market will be more efficient, and then everybody will be better off. This theory is transparently untrue. However, it is widely held by policymakers and for some strange reason in economics departments. What seems actually to happen when you privatize public goods is that it's a way of shifting costs off onto consumers. So in the United States now we have a big crisis of young people having a debt of $150,000 to get a Bachelor of Arts degree. In my generation, we came out with no debt. But this is because neoliberalism has privatized all the state universities. There are no state universities left in the United States. They're all basically private. I teach at one. Our annual income from the state is about 6% of operating revenue. This same kind of process was going on in the Middle East in the 1990s and after the privatization of public goods. And it resulted in all kinds of corruption. It resulted in de facto downward mobility for a lot of Middle Eastern middle classes, and the youth felt it. It also opened the possibility of forms of insider trading. So if the government is made to sell off the government-owned steel mill, the government knows it's going to sell off the steel mill. So Gamal Mubarak of Egypt will call up his friend Ahmed Ez, who's a steel magnate, and say, Ahmed, we're going to sell the state steel mill. There's a real buying opportunity for you. And so Ahmed Ez buys the steel mill, and then he gradually starves it of resources, fires people, and moves the equipment over to his privately owned steel mill and becomes a monopoly on steel in Egypt. That actually happened. And a lot of that kind of thing was happening. So the youth saw this. It was a kind of narrowing of the elite. If you weren't in with the Mubaraks in Egypt or with the Zainuddin bin Ali's in Tunisia, then you were likely sidelined economically and socially in your life. Workers were mistreated, unionization was forbidden, strikes were technically illegal. People struck, but it was technically illegal, and sometimes they weren't allowed to strike. So in one case in Egypt, there was a big textile workers strike, and the state security police, they kind of look like ninjas with these shiny helmets. They came and made the workers work in the factory at the point of a gun. They were not allowed to strike or else. So I would argue that the Republican socialist-leaning governments of the Middle East had made a bargain with the youth that they then systematically disregarded, and the youth were angered by it because what it meant was that their life chances were declining. Then another phenomenon was occurring which seems to have been extremely important in the consciousness of the youth, which is these were republics. And republics differ from monarchies in that there's what Pareto called a circulating ruling class. I mean, the same group of people isn't always there. So in an absolute monarchy like Saudi Arabia, who's going to succeed King Salman? Mohammed bin Salman. Would be another member of the Saudi royal family. Unless there's a Marxist revolution or something, which seems a little unlikely, the Saudi ruling family is going to continue. But Gamal Abdel Nasser was there in Egypt. He came to power partly through a military coup. He was succeeded by someone unrelated to him, Anwar al-Sadat, another officer, but not a family. But by the 1990s and early zeros, a strange phenomenon had emerged in the Arab world that my teacher Saadeddin Ibrahim called Jumlukiya, which in Arabic is putting together the words for monarchy and republicanism. So it would be monarpublicanism. So it's a republic, but the son of the dictator gets to be the dictator. And this was a trend throughout the Middle East, and it actually happened in Syria, where Hafiz al-Assad was succeeded by his son Bashar. And it was planned to happen in Egypt, where Gamal Mubarak was going to succeed Hosni Mubarak, in Yemen, where Mohammed Saleh was going to succeed Ali Abdullah Saleh, and Libya, where Saif Gaddafi was going to succeed Muammar, And in Tunisia, the dictator didn't have a son, but he had a very powerful son-in-law who was likely being groomed to take over and already owned a lot of the Tunisian economy. So one of the big things that they complained about and that they protested about in 2011 was this idea that they would be inherited by so many, like so many sticks of furniture, by the son or the son-in-law of the dictator. And that this corrupt ruling group, which monopolized so much of the economy. In Tunisia, the US Embassy, we know from WikiLeaks, estimated in 2006 that the Zainuddin bin Ali, the dictator, or his family members jointly owned about 50% of the economic activity in Tunisia. And not only did they own it, but they were going to go on owning it into the next generation. So these youth were looking at 60 more years of this stuff. And they were being locked out from jobs, from opportunities. I talked to so many merchants in these countries, in Tunisia and Libya and so forth, who were just not able to make a proper living. In Libya, I went there after the revolution and Gaddafi had been overthrown and killed, and I said, you know, how are things different for you? And they said, well, we never knew what the tariffs on imports were going to be, because Gaddafi was so erratic. He would just wake up 3 months later and change the tariff. So if you had sent people, you know, to Hong Kong or Dubai to bring in electronics, you could only make a profit if the tariffs were at a certain level. But you never knew whether that would be the case when the goods actually arrived, because Gaddafi, you know, we called him Daffy Gaddafi. He was, there are some people who get to be president who seem to be erratic. They didn't. So the idea that this would just go on for another 60 years was really bothering people. In fact, in Egypt, they had when Gamal Mubarak got married, they had the youth had a campaign, which his wife-to-be was a model named Khadija, and the youth were shouting in the streets, and on their blogs they would write, Khadija A, Masr La. Gamal can have Khadija for his wife, but he can't inherit Egypt. So that was a big issue. And we all know the story that in December of 2010, a young man, Mohammed Bouazizi, who may actually not have been Mohammed, and he may not have been a graduate, who was reduced to selling vegetables, was bothered by the police. They wanted to see his permit, and when he showed it to them, they tore it up. And it was police harassment. And he went to the city hall to get another one, and the lady there slapped him and didn't want to give him one. And he was the sole breadwinner for his family, so he went outside City Hall and in his town and put gasoline on himself and set himself afire. Actually, there had been a rash of these economic suicides in Tunisia in the previous couple of years. But his, for some reason, you never know why these things happen, caught the imagination of the Tunisian youth. And the rumor was spread that he was a college graduate, which I think he wasn't. So there began to be protests throughout the country by the youth. And Tunisia has a very strong union system. They have a national union of workers, but then they have one of the branches of it is a college student union and a high school student union, and the teachers are unionized. It's very centralized and it's influenced by the French system. So my own theory about it, as far as I can tell from reading the sources, is that these institutions had been co-opted largely by the government, but at this point they broke loose, a lot of them, and since they were organized, they could be used to call demonstrations, and so you suddenly had, you know, a couple 100,000 people marching in downtown Tunis. The story is that Zainuddin bin Ali, the dictator, called his army chief of staff in when he saw all these people marching against him and said, General, you have to shoot them. And the general looked him in the eye, Ammar Rashid, and said, Mr. President, I'm not going to shoot the Tunisian people for you. Well, if you're a hated dictator and your army chief of staff tells you that, you might as well start the helicopter going right then. So he got on a plane and fled. He was trying to flee to Paris, where he had a chateau. But Paris decided they have 800,000 angry Tunisians. It's unwise to let Ben Ali in. So he was a Flying Dutchman for a while. His plane was up there and no place to go. Of course, there is one place you can always go if you're a hated, deposed dictator. So yes, he is living in Saudi Arabia. Since he spent 20 years making his way in the world by telling the West that he was the only thing that stood between them and barbaric Islam. The idea of him having to live in Wahhabi Saudi Arabia and his wife has to cover up and so forth, the Tunisians still enjoy that tremendously. It wasn't just the youth. There was a lot of input from workers and from professionals. So the lawyers' union joined in. The youth had already established connections of sympathy with the workers in Tunisia, and there had been a Facebook campaign in Egypt by students on behalf of the textile workers. And I think that this kind of sympathy for workers among the student activists is a reflection of their family ideologies. A lot of them came from families that had been Arab nationalists, had been leftists, and the regimes had destroyed, the parties that their parents used to belong to, which had these left-of-center tendencies. So the youth were just brought up as a kind of inchoate, general left-of-center people, but they did sympathize with the workers. And so in Tunisia, they led a campaign for striking mining workers. Although in the West, a lot of emphasis was put on their use of social media, it was an exaggeration. Only 1% of Egyptians were on Twitter, but that was what the New York Times correspondents could easily read, right? So Twitter was played up. Zeynep Tufekci did some exit polling at Tahrir Square in Egypt, found about 25% of people there had come as a result of social media. The rest of them, their friends called them and said, hey, we're going to Tahrir Square, or they heard people chanting in the street. Cairo is extremely dense and densely populated, and so if you just march down the street and you're shouting, we're going to Tahrir Square, we'll be there at 5 p.m., why don't you join us? Everybody in the neighborhood hears that. And they walked neighborhoods. They had records of whether people were welcoming to them when they knocked on a door, whether a particular apartment building was welcoming. They did pamphleteering. They spread around hundreds of thousands of pamphlets. So this idea that they were mainly using the internet is not true. They used the techniques of any democratic society in canvassing, but they were canvassing for a revolution, not for a candidate. Very quickly after the youth managed to overthrow those dictators, the oldsters, the 60-somethings, took over. People sometimes ask me, they say, well, why didn't the youth form parties? Why didn't they take over? I say it would have interfered with their homework. You forget sometimes how young they were. They were 18, they were 20. In most of these countries, you can't even run for office till you're 40. So they used their street power. They used their, what sociologists call their biographical availability, which means the young people have a lot of time on their hands. They don't have to be at work. That they used their bodies. They used all of their advantages to go in the streets and paralyze the country, because that's what they did, right? Is they would just occupy city squares and stay there. They brought tents and they lived there. Nothing was getting done. Government offices not working, people not making any money. So, when the elites heard the youth demand that we're staying here until that guy is gone, they would say, well, that's ridiculous. You know, we got to where we are by depending on that guy. He's our patron. We can't let him go. But then a week went by, 2 weeks went by, nobody making any money, government offices not working, some cities hiving off from the country. And they started thinking, well, how well do we really like that guy? And then after a little bit, they said, you have to go now. So the youth blackmailed the elite into getting rid of those dictators. And in Egypt, it was very clear. The army officer corps put Mubarak on a helicopter and took him out, involuntarily on his part. They provoked a coup. But then the next stage was elections, and in the elections, the Muslim-oriented parties, most of whom had not been prominent in these revolutions. As I said, the revolutions were made by, in the majority, I would say, left-of-center youth or centrist youth. And in Egypt's case, the Muslim Brotherhood actually actively forbade its members from participating. And in Tunisia, the Muslim party had been devastated by oppression. But in the aftermath, the Muslim parties organized and they were popular. The people think that religious parties are less corrupt. They're so naive. So they did well in these elections in 2011. And in Egypt in particular, the victory of the Muslim Brotherhood was absolutely unacceptable to the old Egyptian elite, the officer corps, the businessmen, and so forth. And so ultimately, not only did the elite not want the Muslim Brotherhood in power in Egypt, but also the people didn't. I've seen polling by Gallup that showed in February of 2011, the Muslim Brotherhood had a 62% favorability rating. That's why they won the election. But in June of 2013, they had an 18% favorability rating. So you could just look at the graph of the polling and you could predict a coup was coming. So the officers and the youth all got together and got rid of the Muslim Brotherhood. Unfortunately for the youth, they were kind of tricked, and the officers promised them that they restore democracy, and instead they made a military coup and then started rounding up the youth. And they actually made a law forbidding demonstrations, having come to power on the basis of demonstrations. A lot of my friends that I interviewed ended up in jail, and some of them are still there. In Tunisia, you had a better outcome. And part of it was the electoral system in Tunisia, the way they counted seats in parliament. As you had in Tunisia, it was harder to get a majority. And so the Muslim party got a plurality in parliament, but they didn't get a majority. And they therefore needed secular allies. So they had to go to a socialist party and a human rights party in order to form a government. And then they were constrained by their allies in parliamentary politics. So it never got to the point in Tunisia where the economic and military elite felt that it was just unsupportable that the Muslim-oriented party be in power. I'll just show you a couple of pictures I took in 2011 and 2012 in Tunisia to show you youth activities. This is a celebration of the enclave in Tunis, the capital of Sidi Bou Said, which was founded by the French in 1901 and has now emerged as a kind of Shishi neighborhood. And the youth were staging a festival, so you can't hear it, but there's rock metal music going on in the background, and they're doing graffiti on the streets and just having a good time. I thought that they were selling street art and doing exhibits, and I thought that this triptych was particularly revealing of the youth orientation during the revolutionary era, because there's gay pride, and there's a mosque, and then there's Tunisie Libre, there's free Tunis. So political liberty, religious liberty, and personal liberty were all keynotes for these youth, and you saw it all around us. The Muslim-oriented prime minister and the government that he formed faced severe challenges, not only from the more secular-minded people in Tunisia, from educated women who often marched against them, demanding their rights, and a little bit afraid that the pro-Muslim party would take away rights. But also they faced a challenge from their own right. So there's hardline Salafi movement in Tunisia, which is very tiny. I mean, I was in Tunisia, I never saw Salafis. You can't see, they dress distinctively. You don't very seldom see them. I don't think there were probably more than 5,000 in the country. But they were particularly violent, or at least some of them were. I don't mean to tar them all with the same brush. And there were 2 major assassinations in 2013 in which Salafis were at least blamed. And some of the fault then redounded to the ruling pro-Muslim party, which people put pressure on it. By fall of 2013, you had a second revolution going on in the sense that people wanted the religious party to step down. They had been elected to a 2-year term in 2011, so it was supposed to be over with by October of 2013, and they were supposed to have produced a constitution by then and get ready for then permanent parliamentary elections. They were just a constituent assembly to make the constitution. So massive demonstrations were held in summer and fall of 2013 by the youth. They came back out, they were active, and again they formed an alliance with the National Workers Union and with women's groups, and the pressure was so great that although the Nahda, or the pro-religious government, had won the 2011 election fair and square, it agreed to step down and to have a caretaker government oversee a transition to new elections. And in fall of 2014, the secular Nada Tunis party won parliament. And so you had a successful handover of power from one party to another. So the political scientists define a successful democratic transition as 2 elections in a row. Everybody, all the players agree on the rules of the game, and the losers go home. The losers being willing to go home is a really important part of this. By the way, in 2013, there was an election in Libya where the losing party refused to go home. So we now have at least 2 and maybe 3 governments in Libya. But in Tunisia, the losers went home. The pro-religious party went home and let the secular people come to power. The youth activism has continued. There are many issues that affect the youth and affect people who were very invested in this revolution in Tunisia. There's been a problem with terrorism coming over to some extent from Libya or from France. The Bardo Museum was shot up, and the beach at Sousse was shot up. And the government's instinct is to, well, send in the secret police, crack back down, take away some of the liberties that were won in 2011, and the youth don't want that. So they have protested against any move towards reestablishing an authoritarian government. They haven't been completely successful because more draconian kinds of laws and procedures have been put in Tunisia because of the terrorism scare. Tunisia depends heavily on tourism from Europe, and so terrorism is an economic threat to it. Then another issue has been that initially after the revolution, people who were very close to the old dictator had been forbidden to participate in politics. This is called lustration, when you isolate the old ruling class and sideline it. But the question emerged as, well, for how long are these people going to be sidelined? And they're very wealthy and very well connected. So now, gradually, they're being rehabilitated, and about half of the current ruling party, which is secular-oriented, is made up of members of the old elite. And the youth don't like this. I mean, I shouldn't say all of the youth, but a lot of the youth don't like this. And so they have made major demonstrations against corruption, against the return of the old elite. They've continued to be active in this way. And then just this past week, the youth demonstrated in a big way on Habib Bourguiba Avenue, the main strip in Tunis, against Trump's decision to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem and recognize it as the Israeli capital. Ironically enough, the Israeli war on Little Gaza in 2008-2009 had provoked massive demonstrations in Tunisia, organized by the student unions. And the U.S. Embassy estimated hundreds of thousands of people in the street. And that kind of was a rehearsal for the overthrow of the dictatorship. So the young people are very invested in this issue. And so now this week they've come out again in very large numbers in Habib Bourguiba Avenue to protest this U.S. policy. One of them was interviewed and he said, well, we're here to protest this irrational, racist, and illogical measure. We came to say no, and your policy, I'm sorry? Yeah, your decree will not be allowed to stand. So they say in Jerusalem, the Muslims and the Arabs are there. So again, people have the impression, because this demonstration in Tunis was not on our mass media and it was not on front page of our newspapers and that sort of thing. A lot of what they're doing now is politically consequential, but it's not being reported in the same way that it used to be, I think. So these networked youth, and again, by networked, I don't mean just on the internet, I mean physically in neighborhoods and so forth, were able to shake up an old order. And there are at least 4 countries where politics as it was being done in the 90s and zeros is no longer done that way. And they succeeded in throwing these presidents for life out. They stopped an emerging Republican monarchy. They did, have some failures. One is that I interviewed a lot of people who thought that if only you could get rid of the dictator, magically the economy would improve. This is almost exactly the opposite of reality, because when you have social turmoil, it affects investment and it affects tourism, and so it's likely the economy will suffer for a while. It's now being estimated that Tunisia is just about getting back on track, but that was a long time. And so there's some magical thinking involved. The youth technique of getting these big crowds out into the streets was very successful, but it's not the kind of politics that has staying power. I don't blame them for not forming parties or for not trying to take power because they were so young. But I think they did need to get behind some party that they approved of. And a lot of them didn't. They wouldn't. They boycotted elections. They said this, they wanted a perfect world, and this is not perfect, and so forth. And then it's also the case that the old elites saw this whole movement of the youth as extremely threatening and were determined to crush it. And so the Saudis in particular spread around a lot of money to crush these movements, and they colluded with groups like the Egyptian Officer Corps, and in Yemen they even are now involved in a war, and so forth. Ironically enough, the governments they didn't like Syria, they joined in with the rebels and tried to overthrow them. But they often pushed the rebels in the direction of fundamentalism, which made them unpalatable to the rest of the country, and so contributed to the failure in Syria. But I tell people that In 1968, Václav Havel was a young Czech person who established a pirate radio station to protest against the invasion of Prague by the Soviet tanks. Brezhnev thought that socialism with a human face, if you ever saw Brezhnev, you would understand, it was not going to be allowed. Václav Havel was arrested, and he was a young playwright, and he was forbidden to stage his plays. He was made a non-person, and he had to work in a beer factory. By the early 90s, he was president of the Czech Republic. So people, I think, have written off the Arab youth way too soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juan, for that. We've had a great conversation here, and thank you for your questions. In January, I will be bringing in somebody, Daniel Neat from Georgetown University, to talk about the Syrian civil war. But meanwhile, thank you very much, Juan, for this wonderful conversation and talk.